I walked into my grandfather's mansion that Thanksgiving with my heart full of hope, clutching a small gift I'd saved up for months to buy him. The marble floors gleamed under the chandelier light, and the smell of roasted turkey filled the air. But before I could even say hello, his voice cut through the room like a knife. "You ungrateful little thief," he screamed, his face red with rage. Every head at the dinner table turned toward me. My cousins smirked. My aunts whispered. My uncles looked away. I stood there frozen, my hands trembling, my mind racing to understand what was happening. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I whispered, but my voice was so small it barely existed. In that moment, surrounded by family who should have protected me, I became the villain in a story I didn't even know was being written. What I didn't know then was that this humiliation was just the beginning, and that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who underestimate what you're capable of when you finally decide to fight back. Before we dive deeper into this story of betrayal and justice, I want to invite you to join our community here at Revenge Unleashed. If you love stories about people who refuse to be victims, who stand up against injustice and take back their power, then hit that subscribe button right now. Give this video a like if you believe in karma and poetic justice, and drop a comment below telling me about a time you stood up for yourself. Your stories inspire me, and I read every single one. Now, let's get back to what happened that terrible Thanksgiving, and how everything I thought I knew about my family was about to shatter into a million pieces. My name is Jordan, and I grew up believing my grandfather, Richard Montgomery, was a hero. He built a tech empire from nothing, turned a small software company into a billion-dollar corporation, and became one of the most respected businessmen in the country. My whole life, I heard stories about his brilliance, his work ethic, his generosity to charity. When my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, I thought he'd be my salvation. Instead, he sent me to live with my aunt and uncle while my cousins, Brandon and Ashley, got to stay in the mansion, attend private schools, and enjoy every luxury imaginable. I told myself it was because he was too old to raise another child, that maybe he was protecting me from the pressure of his world. I made excuses for him because I desperately wanted to believe that somewhere deep down, he loved me. I worked my way through community college, juggling 2 jobs while my cousins partied at Ivy League schools on grandfather's dime. I never complained. I never asked for handouts. When I finally graduated and started working as a junior accountant at a small firm, I was proud of myself for making it on my own. That Thanksgiving, I was invited to the family gathering for the first time in years. I thought maybe, finally, grandfather was ready to acknowledge me, to see that I'd become someone worthwhile despite the odds. I spent $300 I barely had on a vintage watch I'd found at an estate sale, something I knew he'd appreciate because it reminded me of one he'd mentioned in an old interview. I practiced what I'd say to him. I imagined him smiling, maybe even hugging me. I was so naive it hurts to think about it now. The accusation came out of nowhere. Grandfather claimed that $50,000 had disappeared from one of his personal accounts, and that somehow, I was responsible. He said he had proof that the bank had traced the transaction to an IP address linked to me. The whole family stared at me like I was a criminal, like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. I tried to explain that I didn't even have access to his accounts, that I barely knew anything about his finances, but he wouldn't listen. Brandon stood up and said he'd always suspected I was jealous of their lifestyle. Ashley cried and said she felt betrayed because she'd always defended me to the family, which was a complete lie. My aunt demanded I leave immediately. And grandfather, the man I'd spent my whole life trying to impress, looked at me with such cold contempt that I felt something break inside my chest. I left that house shaking and crying, my carefully wrapped gift still clutched in my hands. I spent that night alone in my tiny apartment, replaying every moment, trying to understand what had happened. And then, in the quiet darkness, something shifted inside me. The sadness began to harden into something else, something sharp and focused. I'd spent years blaming myself for not being good enough, for not being worthy of my grandfather's love. But that night, I realized that maybe the problem wasn't me. Maybe the problem was that I'd been too trusting, too willing to accept crumbs when I deserved so much more. I decided right then that I wasn't going to let this destroy me. I was going to find out the truth, and I was going to make sure everyone knew it. The next morning, I called in a favor from a friend who worked in cybersecurity. I explained the situation, and he agreed to help me investigate. Within 3 days, he found something interesting. The transaction that supposedly came from my IP address had actually been routed through a sophisticated proxy server, making it look like it originated from my location when it actually came from somewhere else entirely. With a little more digging, we traced the real source back to a computer in my grandfather's own house, specifically to a device registered to Brandon. My perfect, golden boy cousin had stolen from his own grandfather and framed me for it. But why? I spent the next 2 weeks becoming a detective in my own life. I created a fake social media profile and befriended some of Brandon's college friends. I learned that he'd racked up massive gambling debts, over $200,000 owed to some very dangerous people. He'd been desperate, and stealing from grandfather seemed like an easy solution, especially if he could pin it on someone else. I was the perfect scapegoat, the poor relative nobody really cared about, someone whose word meant nothing against the Montgomery name. He'd probably thought it would be simple, that I'd just disappear quietly like I always had before. What he didn't count on was that I'd finally had enough of disappearing. But I didn't want to just expose Brandon. That felt too simple, too easy. If I went to my grandfather with evidence right away, Brandon might worm his way out of it, claim he'd been hacked or make up some excuse. The family might even close ranks to protect him, decide it was easier to believe their golden boy had made a mistake rather than admit he was a thief and a liar. No, I needed something bigger, something that would make the truth impossible to ignore and force everyone to see what I'd known all along, that this family's perfect image was built on lies and favoritism and cruelty toward anyone who didn't fit their mold. I started documenting everything. Every piece of digital evidence, every conversation I could record legally, every financial record I could access through public databases. I discovered that Brandon's spending had been erratic for over a year, cash withdrawals that didn't match his lifestyle, mysterious payments to offshore accounts. I found text messages he'd sent to Ashley complaining about how grandfather owed him for being the perfect grandson, how he deserved more of the inheritance. I even found evidence that he'd forged grandfather's signature on several documents to access accounts he shouldn't have been able to touch. This wasn't just about $50,000. This was about a pattern of entitlement and theft that had been going on for a long time. Then I had an idea that made my hands shake with a mixture of fear and excitement. Grandfather's company was about to celebrate its 50th anniversary with a massive gala event. All the major investors would be there, along with press, industry leaders, and the entire Montgomery family. It was going to be broadcast live on business networks as a celebration of American entrepreneurship and family values. What better stage to reveal the truth? I started planning carefully, reaching out to a journalist I'd read about who specialized in exposing corporate corruption and family scandals. I presented her with all my evidence, everything I'd gathered about Brandon's theft and deception. She was fascinated, especially by the angle of the humble, honest grandchild being scapegoated by the privileged heir. It was the kind of story that would capture public attention and spark conversations about wealth, family, and accountability. The night of the gala arrived. I wasn't officially invited, of course, but I'd purchased a ticket under a different name using money I'd borrowed from friends. I wore a simple black dress I'd found at a thrift store, nothing fancy, but I felt powerful in it because I knew what was coming. I watched from the back of the ballroom as grandfather gave his speech about family values and building a legacy. He talked about integrity and hard work while Brandon stood beside him on stage, grinning like he owned the world. Ashley dabbed at her eyes like she was moved by the beautiful sentiment. The investors applauded. The cameras rolled. And I waited. The journalist had timed it perfectly. Right as grandfather finished his speech and the applause died down, the screens around the ballroom suddenly changed. Instead of showing the Montgomery Company logo, they displayed bank statements, text messages, and a detailed timeline of Brandon's thefts. A video began playing, narrated by the journalist, explaining how the heir to the Montgomery fortune had embezzled from his own family and framed an innocent relative to cover his tracks. The room went silent. You could hear people gasping, the confused murmur growing louder. Grandfather's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Brandon looked around frantically, trying to figure out what was happening. And I just stood there in the back, tears streaming down my face, finally feeling like I could breathe for the first time in months. Security tried to shut down the presentation, but it was too late. The story was already going viral online. The journalist had published her article at the exact same moment, complete with all the evidence I'd provided. Within hours, it was trending on every social media platform. News outlets picked it up. People who'd been at the gala were giving interviews about what they'd witnessed. The perfect Montgomery image was crumbling in real time, and I'd orchestrated it all from the shadows, just like Brandon had tried to do to me. The aftermath was chaotic and painful and oddly satisfying all at once. Brandon was arrested within days, charged with theft, fraud, and identity manipulation. The investigators found even more evidence of his crimes once they started looking. Ashley was implicated too because she'd helped him cover his tracks, though she claimed she didn't know the full extent of what he was doing. My aunt and uncle were humiliated, their social standing destroyed overnight. And grandfather, the man I'd once idolized, had to face the reality that he'd built his family on favoritism and blind loyalty rather than actual values. A week after the gala, I received a phone call from grandfather's lawyer asking me to come to the mansion. I almost didn't go, but curiosity got the better of me. When I arrived, grandfather was sitting in his study, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He didn't yell this time. Instead, he asked me to sit down, his voice quiet and defeated. He apologized, actually used the word sorry, which I'd never heard from him before. He said he'd been wrong about me, that he'd let his pride and his favoritism blind him to the truth. He offered me money, a position in the company, a place in the family. He said he wanted to make things right. I looked at this old man who'd caused me so much pain, and I felt something unexpected, pity mixed with a strange kind of peace. I told him I didn't want his money or his guilt. I'd already accepted a job offer from a competing firm, one that valued merit over family connections. I'd already started building a life that didn't depend on his approval or his legacy. I thanked him for the apology because it did mean something to hear it, but I also told him that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. I'd spent too many years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it freely. It was time for me to invest that energy in myself instead. As I walked out of that mansion for what I knew would be the last time, I felt lighter than I had in years. Revenge wasn't about making them suffer, though there was admittedly some satisfaction in watching the truth come out. Real revenge was reclaiming my own story, refusing to be the victim they tried to make me, and building a life so authentic and fulfilling that their rejection no longer had power over me. I'd learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about who shows up for you, who believes in you, who treats you with dignity and respect. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who will never see your worth, no matter how hard you try to prove it. Looking back now, that terrible Thanksgiving was actually a gift in disguise. It forced me to stop making excuses for people who didn't deserve them. It taught me that speaking up for yourself isn't cruel or vindictive, it's necessary. It showed me that the truth has a power all its own, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let liars control your narrative. I'm not saying it was easy or that I didn't have moments of doubt and pain. But I am saying that on the other side of that fire, I found a version of myself I actually liked, someone strong enough to demand better and brave enough to walk away when better wasn't offered. So if you're watching this and you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've ever been scapegoated or dismissed or made to feel like you don't matter, I want you to know something important: your story isn't over yet. The people who underestimate you are making a mistake, and the moment you decide to stop accepting their version of reality is the moment everything changes. Stand up. Speak your truth. Gather your evidence. And when the time is right, show the world exactly who you are and what you're capable of. Because the best revenge isn't just proving them wrong, it's building a life so genuine and fulfilling that their opinion becomes completely irrelevant. That's real power. That's real justice. And that's what I hope you take away from my story today.